Hi guys, it's Mrs. Wallace. I just wanted to give you a little bit more information to finish our discussion about populism so that you would be able to think about the allegory of the Wizard of Oz. And we were addressing kind of the issues that farmers faced, and just to remind you, a lot of the issues that farmers faced had to do with the low prices they were getting for their agricultural goods, just increasingly low prices, and also kind of this issue that they really saw banks and railroads kind of taking advantage of them. In the case of railroads, they were being charged really high prices for things like moving their goods around, and they also felt like banks were taking advantage of them, and they weren't getting fair interest rates, and they didn't really have a lot of wiggle room to pay back some of their loans. And those particular issues really put the farmers in a very, very challenging place, even way before the economic crisis of the 1890s. So the Populist Party, sometimes called the People's Party, really kicked off in the presidential election of 1892, and they ran a national candidate as a third party. So the Populist Party ran James B. Weaver. You can see his picture over there on the right. He's kind of the poster boy of populism, at least as it begins, and he does end up getting about almost 10% of the electoral vote. I'm sorry, 10% of the popular vote, maybe more like 5% of the electoral vote, but he does fairly well, and it kind of gives an indication that the Populist Party maybe is something that is shared, and part of what the Populist Party is looking for is some significant changes. They really do well locally, so whereas they don't necessarily win the election of 1892, they do win quite a few governorships. So there's Midwestern states that are going to be primarily led by populists, and they have quite a few congressional seats. So the platform, you guys have a document that really outlines from the meeting that was really held in the 1890s. There's this listing of particular agenda items. Take a look at that document so you can read the actual language that was created by the 1,500 or so delegates that were at the conference, but just a listing of some of the things that were perhaps most significant. And there's a few. I won't necessarily dabble on all of them, but there are political and economic changes that the populists are really interested in. First on the list here, you see the system of sub-treasuries. Just note that this is almost like some sort of subtle banking system where the farmers wanted there to be almost like these storage areas where grain could exist but serve as collateral against loans that could be lent out against that grain as collateral. So the sub-treasury system is almost like a localized bank that enables farmers to use the collateral that they're most likely to have, which is essentially, agricultural goods. There is a need to the farmers to abolish the national bank. The national bank was recreated again in American history after the Civil War to deal with some of the monetary issues. The farmers don't want any part of a national bank. The direct election of senators is actually enabling some political power for the people. At this time, state legislative bodies actually selected members of the Senate from each state, and so people didn't directly elect their senators until the early 1900s. This actually becomes the 17th Amendment in the Constitution. The populists also want government ownership of railroads. They feel like it's kind of like a public utility that should be regulated in order to be fair. Otherwise, the railroads are, price gouging. They're not publishing their rates. They're not transparent. Farmers felt like they were being overcharged and felt like they were victimized by the railroads. Populists do have this strain where they are, in some cases, anti-immigrant. Unions, in some cases, could also be guilty of this, and part of the idea was just kind of enabling greater access to jobs and land. In the case of farmers, they didn't want the Midwest land to be actually sold to immigrants, and they wanted to kind of have a heritage of having white farmers in the Midwest, and some of that maybe speaks to earlier movements and ethnocentrism. The other things that the farmers were calling for were things that maybe would appeal to laborers, to try to get laborers to kind of join in on the populist platform. So some of the items were things like 8-hour workday, or getting rid of groups that were involved in labor conflicts, like strike breakers, like the Pinkertons. The secret ballot is another item that kind of goes along with the direct election of senators. The secret ballot was not available at this time. For the most part, ballots were color-coded, and everybody in the room could easily know who you voted for. It was very easy for people to be pressured to vote a certain way because everybody knew how you voted. So the advent of the secret ballot enabled, a lot more privacy in voting. It's also in the 17th Amendment. The remonetization of silver we'll kind of talk about separately. This becomes number 9, the hotbed issue, the emotional issue of the day. It's what people fight about. It's what people write about. Everything is about the issue of silver. And they also wanted a single term for president, so just kind of keeping some of the element of potential corruption and whatnot, kind of keeping more power to the people, less to, the likelihood of there being kind of alliances and relationships between government, corporations, and some of that. Here you can see the map for the 1892 election, and just kind of note the states in green, kind of where the populists do well. So this is some of the states where you have agriculture, and again, they do earn almost, I think it's like 9%, 9 or 10% of the populist vote. The bimetallism issue is really the big issue of the day, and the two kind of things you see in this cartoon is silver and gold. And at this point in time, money is not fiat money. It's not backed up like it is today in just the faith we have in the value of the dollar, but it's actually pegged to the value of gold. So, money could actually be exchanged in a local bank for gold, and gold was seen as like stable currency, and the value of gold, of course, fluctuated and depended on the scarcity of gold. And the government oftentimes would set kind of the value of gold, but that could change, depending on what was happening. So the way in which farmers simply looked at silver, and there had been a time earlier in history when silver and gold together backed up the currency, and it was like at a ratio of 16-1. So 16 ounces of silver equaled 1 ounce of gold, which could then equal a certain amount of paper currency. And the silverites, over time, there's like different things that happen with silver being actually more in demand or less in demand. So there are times when the government's interested in adding silver to the money supply, and times when it's not. But in the 1890s, mid-1890s or early 1890s, the silver is not in the money supply. Government had purchased some, but never coined it. And so there's an interest in actually adding silver to the money supply. And the farmers want it for one reason. They want to inflate the money supply. Farmers are looking for higher prices for their goods. They face deflation, and they want greater kind of access to money, only so that when they pay back their debts, which are kind of fixed, they're actually paying back with dollars that are worth less, and ultimately, of course, bankers don't like that. So there's sides in this issue of whether or not to have silver added to the money supply, because some people are actually going to benefit from inflation and some people are not, and farmers benefit, others don't. And to the farmers, this issue of deflation and kind of stagnating prices could definitely be solved by there being inflation. So silver is looked at as the kind of Superman of the time. The Panic of 1893 is this giant economic recession, so it's right after the presidential election. A year later, there is this very large trigger of events that lead to a giant recession. So in some cases, the fundamental things that go wrong that lead to the 1893 panic is way too much speculation and overbuilding. The market kind of retracts, kind of contracts a little bit, especially in the railroad industry. When the railroads start to get smaller and pull back, stocks become a little bit unstable, so there's a bit of a speculative crash, and then as a result, there's lots of bank failures. Other industries also contract because the railroad has. So things are very intertwined in the economy in 1893, and when one industry starts to suffer, others do as well. The banks that had supported some of the funding for these various building projects like the railroads start to go under. So, collectively, business failure leads to large amounts of unemployment, and people are much less excited about the role of corporations and the Rockefellers and the Carnegies. They're also much more excited about the populist agenda as a result of the crisis of 1893. It seems almost like kind of a Marx version of the world is starting to come to fruition, and there is an inequity issue, and it's becoming more clear as the recession is ongoing. So it's kind of a timing piece that adds to the Populist Party's appeal. This is just a small song that gives you a sense of maybe where the farmers were coming from. And this was actually written out in sheet music with an illustrated cover of, all of these farmers doing what they do. They're about almost 50% of the population at this time. When the banker says he's broke and the merchant's up in smoke, they forget that it's the farmer who feeds them all. So, a lot of this is about kind of the who is important in society, whose role should be more important than others. So in these days of social Darwinism, farmers are kind of rejecting some of that notion and reminding people, guess what? Farmers are really the folks who are, really being productive, and somebody who's like a bond seller, is not really doing anything that's that important, and farmers kind of uphold some of that. Coxey's Army, this photograph just really reflects kind of a group of people who take it upon themselves to fight on behalf of laborers and farmers, marching about 500 strong to the White House, and it kind of represents, in a sense, the despair that people are willing to go, and the way some people see the government as maybe a final kind of spot to seek some type of change. And if political change was going to happen, you could argue it starts with Coxey's Army. It's not in any way successful, but he calls for things like an end to child labor, improving, access to work and things like that. The election of 1892 is the election of 1896 is probably one of the biggest elections in American history. It is an emotional kind of roller coaster, and there are a few candidates. At first, the Populists are a third party, and they seek kind of a very similar agenda that they did in 1892, and they're looking to kind of sport a particular candidate. And in the meantime, the Republican and the Democratic candidates are also lining up. The picture that you're looking at of the great commoner is William Jennings Bryan, who becomes significant in this time period as a young, dashingly handsome, loud, really good public speaker. He becomes really the guy at the Democratic primary, and his particular speeches go over really well. He delivers a speech that taps into some of the populist agenda. He actually talks about free silver and the wrongness of having gold as the only supporter of the money supply. And, he speaks to kind of the common man, this idea of the common man really enabling, having more access, to his fair share, and kind of how the common man is also a businessman. Some of those elements, he does a dashing speech, and he actually wins over members of the Populist Party who realize they can't really compete on the same agenda items with this really good orator. So the Populists put all of their weight into the Democratic candidate of William Jennings Bryan. This is an actual image of William Jennings Bryan. He is kind of very, elaborate when he speaks, and a lot of what he noted is kind of, again, the idea of free silver and very, very much kind of a worker plus farmer type of platform. His cross of gold speech ends with this famous line, "You shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold."